The afternoon sun hammered down on the alkali flats with punishing ferocity, turning the air into something visible and trembling. Heat rose in shimmering columns that bent the horizon into impossible shapes. Olga Petrovich knelt in the meager shadow of a collapsed prospector's shack, her fingers working methodically through brittle stems of feverfew that somehow grew in the cracks between sun-bleached stones. The plants were small, twisted survivors, and she needed them desperately. 3 homesteaders had appeared at her back door the previous night, burning with fever, and her supply of medicinal herbs had dwindled to almost nothing. She had been gathering for perhaps an hour when the pain struck without warning. A band of iron closed around her ribcage, crushing the air from her lungs with brutal efficiency. Her vision grayed at the edges, then darkened. She dropped the handful of feverfew, both hands clawing at her chest at the rough cotton of her man's shirt. Beneath it, the whalebone stays of her corset dug into flesh and bone with surgical precision. She had laced it too tight this morning, anxious about maintaining the fiction that kept her alive and practicing medicine in this territory that forbade women physicians. Hoofbeats rumbled up from the wash behind her, growing louder with alarming speed. Olga tried to stand, managed only to stagger forward 3 stumbling steps before her knees buckled. The sand rose to meet her, hot enough to sear exposed skin. She hit the ground, hard tasting blood and alkali dust. Her lungs screamed for air that would not come. The whalebone stays had shifted, pressing against something vital, a rib perhaps, or the diaphragm itself. Each attempted breath brought only a teaspoon of oxygen, nowhere near enough. The riders were close now, close enough that she could hear the jingle of tack and the creak of saddle leather. Through the haze of oxygen deprivation, she recognized the cadence, if not the specific words. Ranch hands. Pike's men most likely patrolling land the cattle baron claimed, despite territorial surveys that suggested otherwise. If they found her here trespassing as they would see it, there would be questions she could not answer. The kind of questions that ended with exposure arrest or worse. A shadow fell across her, tall and solid, mercifully blocking the punishing sun. Olga looked up, expecting boots and gun barrels and violence. Instead, she saw a man crouching beside her, with the fluid economy of movement that spoke of someone who had spent his life reading danger in wind and silence. He was Lakota. She registered this through the fog of suffocation. Tall, perhaps 30 years of age, with black hair that hung loose past his shoulders, except where eagle feathers were bound near his temple with rawhide cord. His face was angular and weathered, with dark eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. He wore buckskin trousers, a cotton shirt open at the throat, and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork. A hunting knife rested in a sheath at his belt. "Let me help," he said, his English accented but clear, each word deliberate and measured. He drew the knife in one smooth motion, angling the blade so sunlight ran along its edge. Olga's oxygen-starved brain struggled to process what was happening. The knife came toward her, and some animal part of her mind screamed danger, but her body would not respond. The man's free hand settled on her shoulder, not restraining, just steadying. His touch was warm through the fabric. "Be still," he said quietly. Then he caught the edge of her collar between 2 fingers, pulled it away from her throat, and with absolute precision cut through the topmost stay of her corset, where it pressed against her collarbone. The release was instantaneous and overwhelming. Air rushed into her lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp that was half sob, half cough. She bent forward, her body convulsing with the effort of breathing, her vision swimming with tears and relief. The man kept his hand on her shoulder, an anchor in the spinning world. She heard the soft snick of the knife folding closed, felt him shift his weight to position himself more completely between her and the approaching riders. "Breathe slow," he told her, voice pitched low and calm as still water. "Count to 4, in and out. She managed 3 shuddering breaths before the sound of horses being reined up hard penetrated her awareness. The riders had arrived. Through watering eyes, she saw them 3 men on horseback, all wearing the dust-stained clothes and hard expressions of men paid to enforce someone else's will. The nearest one, a wiry man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow, leaned forward in his saddle. "That the trespasser Pike's been complaining about," he called out. The second rider, younger and broader across the shoulders, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Looks like some fool picking weeds on claimed land." The third man was older gray, showing in his beard, and his hand rested with practiced readiness on the butt of his revolver. "Who's the Injun?" The Lakota warrior rose to his feet with the same fluid grace he had shown in everything else, placing himself fully between Olga and the mounted men. His stance was deceptively relaxed, weight-balanced hands loose at his sides, not threatening in any obvious way, but absolutely ready. Olga found her hand reaching out without conscious thought, her fingers closing around his wrist. The solid warmth of his forearm beneath her palm was the most real thing in a world gone strange. "She can't run," the warrior said, his tone unchanged from the gentle instructions about breathing. Matter of fact. "You talk to me, too." The scarred rider's eyes narrowed. "We're talking to whoever we damn well please, Crowfoot." Crowfoot. The name found purchase in Olga's memory among fragments of overheard conversation. The Lakota guide who led freight wagons through impossible terrain, who interpreted at treaty talks, who kept to himself. The townsfolk spoke of him with respect and unease in equal measure. The warrior Crowfoot, though she suspected that was not what his people called him, kept his attention fixed on the riders. He was reading them, she realized. Reading the tension in their shoulders, the way their horses shifted the position of hands relative to weapons. Calculating probabilities with focused intensity. "She's gathering medicine plants," he said. "Not Pike's cattle, not Pike's water." "Pike says everything out here's his," the younger rider countered. "Says anyone crossing his land answers to him. Then Pike can ride out and ask her himself." The older man with the gray beard shifted in his saddle, his horse sidling nervously. "You vouching for this one, Crowfoot?" The warrior angled his body a fraction of an inch, ensuring Olga was completely hidden from any potential line of fire. "I'm saying she can't run. You're 3 men with guns talking to one woman who can't breathe and 1 man with a knife. You want to make that into something we can. Or you can ride back and tell Pike she was gathering feverfew on open ground. Public land, according to the last survey." Silence pressed down on them. Olga could hear her own heartbeat thundering, could taste copper and dust. The wind gusted, lifting grit in small spirals between the horse's legs. She kept her grip on the warrior's wrist, anchoring herself, and felt the absolute steadiness of his pulse. Not calm, controlled. There was a difference. The scarred rider straightened slowly. "Pike won't like it." "Pike doesn't like much," the warrior agreed. More silence. Then the older man grunted and turned his horse's head. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. The other 2 followed, though the scarred one kept glancing back his expression, promising this was not finished. Only when they were small shapes wavering on the heat-distorted horizon did Olga release her grip. She sat back on her heels, one hand pressed to her chest where the pain had been. It had subsided to a dull ache now that she could breathe properly, but terror still trembled through her. The warrior turned to face her, crouching to bring himself to her eye level. "You need water," he said. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He produced a canteen, uncapped it with economical movements, and held it out. Olga drank the water, warm and metallic, but precious. When she lowered the canteen, she found him watching her with those dark, assessing eyes. "Thank you." She managed her accent, making the words sound heavier than they should. Russian by birth, she had learned English from her father's British colleagues, but it remained a borrowed tongue. "Why risk it for weeds?" he asked. "Not weeds. Medicine." She gestured at her scattered gathering bag. "People need it." "People in Cinderbluff have a doctor." "Had." Olga corrected, meeting his gaze. "Dr. Burnham died last week. Cholera. I was his assistant." She saw the moment he understood what she was not saying, and the flicker of comprehension followed by something that might have been respect. He glanced at her shirt, at the way it hung differently now, with one corset stay cut, then back to her face. He did not comment, did not ask questions. Simply stood, offered his hand, and pulled her to her feet with a grip that was strong but careful. "Storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the eastern horizon, where bronze clouds were building with unnatural speed. "We should move." Olga bent to gather her scattered plants, shoving them into the canvas bag with trembling hands. The warrior collected her fallen hat, knocked dust from it, and handed it over. Their fingers brushed. His were calloused, scarred across the knuckles, warm. "Why did you help me?" The question escaped before she could consider whether she wanted the answer. He paused, considering. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the promise of rain. "Because you couldn't breathe," he said finally, as if this explained everything. Then he turned and started walking toward the cottonwoods that marked the creek. Olga followed, clutching her bag and hat ribs aching with every step. She wanted to ask his real name, wanted to know how he had known exactly where to cut, wanted to understand the calculation that led him to step between her and armed men. But exhaustion stole her words. They reached the cottonwoods, just as the storm hit winds strong enough to bend trees and tear leaves loose in swirling clouds. The warrior pointed toward rocks, forming a shallow overhang. They ducked inside as the world disappeared behind a wall of dust. Olga pressed her back against stone, pulled her hat low, and focused on breathing. In for 4 counts, out for 4. The broken corset stay dug into her side, a small discomfort that felt almost like freedom. Beside her, separated by perhaps 6 inches, the warrior sat watching the storm with patient attention. She watched him instead. Watched dust settle on his hair like ash, watched the steady rhythm of his breathing, watched his eyes track invisible movement. And she felt something unfurl in her chest, fragile and fierce, that had nothing to do with gratitude. This was someone who understood survival, who understood being different, being forced to navigate a world with no place prepared for you. The storm lasted perhaps an hour. When it finally passed, they emerged cautiously. The warrior checked the area with swift efficiency, then nodded. "I'll walk you back to town," he said. She wanted to refuse to prove independence, but practicality won. They walked in silence, following the creek toward Cinderbluff. When they reached the town's edge where the boarding house cast long shadows, he stopped. "You should wear that looser," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her chest. "Or not at all. Can't help people if you can't breathe." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of alleys before she could respond. Olga stood alone, dusty and aching, and thought about breathing, about choice and necessity and survival. She did not yet know this afternoon would be the first thread in a tapestry that would reshape both their lives. But some part of her deeper than logic had already begun to understand. Cinderbluff existed because of geography and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. It sat where 2 freight roads intersected, one running north to the mining camps, the other east to the railhead, 2 days' hard ride away. The town had grown pragmatically around this junction, perhaps 15 buildings, all false-fronted wood, weathered to uniform gray-brown. The saloon anchored the north end, a two-story structure with a sagging balcony. Moving south stood the boarding house, the assay office, with barred windows, the general store housing the telegraph, the freight yard, the schoolhouse, and finally the church that doubled as a meeting hall. Beyond the main street sprawled smaller structures, dugouts carved into hillsides, sod houses, animal pens, the livery, and Elias Bracken's blacksmith forge sitting slightly apart as if the blacksmith preferred distance. Water came from Cinder Creek, which gave the town its name and ran year-round, though it shrank to a trickle in summer. The creek's reliability was the only reason the town existed. In this country, water was life. Everything else came second. Olga had arrived in February, when wind cut like knives and frost formed on window interiors. She had come on the weekly stage from the railhead, her possessions packed in one battered trunk and a carpet bag clutched on her lap. The driver had deposited her outside the boarding house, and she had stood in frozen mud, looking at this place that would become home or grave, unable to predict which. Dr. Josiah Burnham had been waiting. A man in his 60s with a magnificent white beard and the bent posture of someone who had spent years hunched over surgical tables. His handshake had been firm, his eyes shrewd. Within 5 minutes, he had said, "You understand this is the only way. If they know what you are, they won't let you practice. Won't let you touch their children, their wives. The lie protects you. Remember that when it chafes." She had understood. She had spent 3 years studying under her father in Russia, learning from cadavers and battlefield casualties and women who came in darkness because no respectable physician would see them. She knew her competence the way she knew her own bones. But competence meant nothing when law said women could not be doctors, when medical schools refused them, when licensing boards dismissed applications without consideration. So she had cut her hair, bound her breasts with linen that later became a linen chest binder under a men's wool vest, practiced lowering her voice to careful tenor, and signed letters O. Petrovich in handwriting that revealed nothing. The person who met the stage that February afternoon wore trousers and a man's coat and answered to the doctor's assistant. If townsfolk noticed anything odd about the slender young man with delicate hands and no beard, they kept it to themselves. Burnham vouched for his assistant's skill, and in Cinderbluff, practical competence outweighed curiosity. For 6 months they had worked together. Burnham taught frontier medicine, treating rattlesnake bite and scorpion sting, dosing laudanum for men who had been drinking, and those who had not, stitching knife wounds, recognizing early signs of cholera and typhus. She taught him newer surgical techniques from Edinburgh and Berlin, better sterilization methods using boiled water and carbolic acid. They made a good team. Then cholera came to the railroad camps in late June. Burnham had gone to treat sick workers staying 2 weeks because cases kept multiplying. He had sent a brief note. Situation dire. Prepare clinic for overflow. Use books in locked cabinet for protocols. She had prepared, but overflow never came. Instead, 3 weeks after he left, Burnham's body returned in a freight wagon wrapped in canvas and dusted with lime. Sheriff Halder had come the day after burial, his bulk filling the doorway. "Town don't need a pretend doctor," he had said, voice deceptively mild. "Close-up shop. That's a 6-hour ride to Red Rock." Olga had replied, keeping her voice level and low. "And the territorial physician comes twice yearly if we're lucky. People will die. Not my concern." Halder had shrugged. "Not yours anymore either." But she had made it her concern. Patients still came after dark, a farmer with a crushed hand, a feverish child, a pregnant woman bleeding. Olga treated them all, charging nothing or nearly nothing, forging Burnham's signature on dosing slips required for laudanum and morphine from the general store. She kept the clinic lamp burning late, and she waited for Halder to make good on his threat. May Calloway had appeared the second week, arriving near midnight, with a basket containing bread preserves and coffee. A woman in her 40s, thin as wire with iron-gray hair, pulled severely back. She taught at the schoolhouse and had lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years prior. "Heard you're still seeing patients," May had said without preamble. "Heard you saved Jacob Miller's hand. That true, I did what I could." "Good." May had set the basket down. "I'll bring this every Tuesday. Keep doing what you're doing. Town needs you." The bread became regular, and with it came information. May noticed everything and said little, but when she spoke, it was worth hearing. She told Olga about tensions building between cattle baron Bennett Pike and homesteaders near Kettle Creek. Pike ran thousands of head on range, he claimed, by occupation, though territorial surveys suggested otherwise. He was a man who had come west with money after the war and turned it into more through shrewdness and strategic intimidation. "He's pushing hard this summer," May had said one evening over weak tea. "Fence posts pulled, water holes fouled. Turned back 3 homesteader families at gunpoint. Says the land is his." "What does Halder do?" May's laugh had been bitter. "Halder does what Pike pays him to do. Nothing." It was into this web that Olga had stumbled on the afternoon she nearly suffocated. And it was the warrior named Crowfoot who had saved her, though she did not yet understand the significance. She learned his real name 3 days later from Elias Bracken. The blacksmith was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a scar running from left eye to jaw, a souvenir from Gettysburg. He had come west to escape ghosts, built his forge at town's edge, where he could see horizon in all directions. "His name's Nayati." Elias had said, working iron on his anvil with steady ringing blows. "Means he who wrestles. Lakota name. Settlers call him Crowfoot because he tracks like a crow, sees things nobody else can. Been guiding freight wagons 3 years. Good man. Honest. Why isn't he with his people?" Elias had paused, hammer above anvil. "Because they exiled him. Don't know the whole story, but it had to do with a raid he refused to join. Said it would harm children. Council didn't see it that way." A man exiled for refusing to harm children. A man who had stepped between her and armed riders without hesitation. The shape of his character was becoming clearer. She saw him occasionally, after that, leading a mule with pelts, repairing tack outside the livery, translating when Lakota families came to trade. They exchanged nods, nothing more. But she felt his attention, sometimes a weight like winter sunlight. And when she looked up, he would be watching with that same assessing gaze. 3 weeks after the desert incident, the schoolhouse bell rang frantically at midday, sharp peals cutting through afternoon heat. Olga was grinding willow bark when she heard commotion. She set down mortar and pestle, wiped her hands, and stepped into the street. A crowd had gathered near the schoolhouse, pressed close around something on the ground. May stood at the edge, face white. She saw Olga and waved urgently. Olga pushed through. A girl lay in the dirt, face contorted with pain, one leg bent unnaturally. Ruthie Callahan, 15 years old, homesteader's daughter. A massive wood splinter thick as a thumb protruded from her right thigh. Blood soaked through her skirt and pooled beneath her. "Someone get Dr. Burnham," a man called. "Burnham's dead, fool," another answered. "There ain't no doctor." Olga dropped to her knees, hands already assessing. The splinter had entered the outer thigh and angled inward, driven deep. If it had nicked the femoral artery, the girl would already be dead. As it was, she was in shock, breathing shallow and rapid, skin cold despite heat. "Get her inside the schoolhouse," Olga said, voice sharp with authority. I need clean watercloth for bandages and someone to hold a lantern steady. The crowd hesitated. A woman in a sunbonnet frowned. Who are you to give orders? I'm the person who can save her leg, Olga said, meeting the woman's eyes. Or you can argue while she bleeds to death. May stepped forward. Do what she says. 4 men lifted Ruthie, carefully carrying her inside. May cleared desks with a sweep of her arm. They laid the girl on the teacher's table. Ruthie whimpered, eyes rolling back. Olga pressed fingers to the girl's wrist, counting pulse. Too fast, too thready. She looked at the crowd pressing the doorway. Everyone out except May and one person with light. Nayati appeared in the doorway, lantern already in hand. He did not ask permission, simply stepped inside and positioned himself at the table's head, adjusting flame until it cast steady light. His presence was calm, unobtrusive, exactly what was needed. Olga's hands moved quickly. She cut away Ruthie's skirt, exposing the wound. The splinter was lodged deep, wood fragments embedded in muscle. Pulling it straight would tear tissue and cause catastrophic bleeding. She needed to widen the entry, remove it in pieces, then suture closed. She had no chloroform, no ether. Ruthie would have to endure this conscious. Hold her shoulders, Olga told May. To Nayati. Keep that light steady. She poured water over her hands, scrubbed with carbolic solution, and selected her smallest scalpel. The blade was sharp enough to split hair. She pressed it to skin around the splinter's entry and made a swift, shallow incision. Ruthie screamed, raw sound echoing off walls. May held her down, murmuring meaningless reassurances. Olga worked with focused intensity. She widened the wound carefully, exposing the splinter's path. It had splintered on entry, leaving barbs hooked in muscle. She used forceps to grasp the largest piece, angling to avoid tearing, and drew it out in one smooth motion. Ruthie convulsed, then went limp, then went unconscious, a mercy. She's breathing, May said, voice tight. Olga nodded, already reaching for the next fragment. 20 minutes to remove all pieces, each placed on clean cloth for accounting. When the wound was finally clear, she irrigated with boiled water and began stitching. Small, precise sutures, the kind her father had taught her on leather scraps before she ever touched a patient. By the time she tied off the final stitch and splinted Ruthie's leg with broken crate planks, the girl was stirring. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. You're going to be fine, Olga told her, wiping sweat from her forehead. Stay off that leg 3 weeks. May will check on you. Ruthie's mother pushed through, then sobbing, falling on her daughter. Olga stepped back, hands shaking now that adrenaline drained. She looked down and realized her corset had shifted during the operation, loosened enough to breathe deeply, but not enough to be invisible. Several people in the crowd were staring with new understanding. Before anyone could speak, commotion erupted outside. A horse thundered to a stop. A young ranch hand stumbled into the schoolhouse, eyes wild. It's Mr. Pike's boy, he gasped. Bull gored him in the throat. Can't breathe. Someone said there might be a doctor. Every eye turned to Olga. Sheriff Halder pushed through, then florid face slick with sweat. He looked at Olga, at blood on her hands, and apron at Ruthie on the table. You've been practicing without a license, he said slowly. That's a crime. She just saved my daughter's life. Ruthie's mother said, voice shaking. You want to arrest her for that? Halder's jaw worked. He glanced at the ranch hand, still gasping, then back to Olga. Political calculation played across his face. You can try to save Pike's boy, he said finally. But if you fail, or if those papers are forged, you'll answer for it. Olga met his gaze. I'll need my bag from the clinic and transport to Pike's ranch. Nayati handed the lantern to May and stepped forward. I'll take her. Halder opened his mouth to object, then closed it. He nodded curtly. Go. They rode in a borrowed buckboard Nayati driving with reins loose horses running hard across prairie. Olga clung to the bench medical bag in her lap, mind already running through procedure. Horn wound to throat-crushing windpipe. If the boy couldn't breathe, he would suffocate within minutes. She had to perform tracheotomy field incision at the cricothyroid membrane reed tube airway carbolic wash quickly and precisely. She had done it twice before in her father's surgery on garroted soldiers. Both men had survived. Pike's ranch loomed all sharp angles and raw lumber designed to intimidate. They clattered into the yard, ranch hands swarming. Olga jumped down before anyone could help, ignoring rib pain, and followed hands into the house. The boy, about 12, lay on the kitchen table, face blue chest, heaving in useless gasps. His father, Bennett Pike, stood over him. Pike was in his 40s, bull-necked, ham-fisted. His face showed fury and something like fear. "Fix him," Pike snarled. Olga didn't waste breath. She opened her bag, pulled scalpel and hollow reed salvaged from a buggy whip, and poured whiskey over both. She turned to Nayati, who had followed without being asked. "Hold him still." Nayati placed hands on the boy's shoulders, firm but not cruel. Olga felt for the soft hollow at the throat's base, the cricothyroid membrane, and marked it with her thumb. Then she drove the scalpel in with one swift, controlled motion. Blood welled. She ignored it, widening the incision just enough to insert the reed. She slid it in at a slight angle, felt resistance, then sudden give as it entered the trachea. She blew a sharp breath through to clear debris, and air whistled through. The boy's chest expanded. Color began returning. Pike let out a held breath. He'll live. If infection doesn't set in. Olga said, hands securing the reed with thread, tying careful sutures. He'll need the tube several days, possibly a week. The windpipe should heal enough after that for him to breathe on his own. Keep the wound clean. Boiled water only. If you see red streaks, send for me immediately. She finished sutures and stood hands steady despite tremor in her chest. Her hat had come off, hair hung loose. There was no hiding anymore. Pike looked at her for a long moment. "You're a woman," he said flatly. "I'm a physician," Olga corrected. She began cleaning instruments. "Your son is alive. That's what matters." Pike's eyes narrowed. Halder mentioned forged papers. "I was Dr. Burnham's assistant. I learned from him. The work I do is real, even if the name isn't mine." Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the boy's breathing through the reed. Pike looked at his son, its steady chest rise and fall. When he looked back, calculation had replaced fear. "You'll stay tonight," he said. Not a request. "Make sure he keeps breathing. Morning, we'll discuss terms." Ice slid down Olga's spine. "Terms? I'll pay you to be my ranch doctor. Exclusive contract. You treat my men, my family, nobody else without permission." Pike's smile was thin and cold. "Fair, considering I'm the only reason Halder isn't locking you up." Nayati's hand closed on Olga's elbow, light touch, but waited. She glanced at him, saw warning in his eyes. Refusing Pike outright meant arrest, possibly worse. Accepting meant becoming his property. "I'll think about it," she said carefully. "You do that." Pike gestured to a hand. "Show them to the guest room. Make sure they don't leave till I say." They were escorted upstairs to a small room with narrow bed washstand, single window overlooking the yard. The door closed, but did not lock. Olga sat on the bed's edge bag at her feet and pressed hands to her face. "He'll use this to control me," she said, voice muffled. Nayati stood by the window, looking at darkening prairie. "He'll try." "What do I do?" He was silent a moment, profile outlined by fading light. "You breathe," he said finally. Tomorrow you decide what you're willing to trade for freedom. Olga looked at him, at calm certainty in his posture, and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but knowledge she was not facing this alone. She nodded slowly, then reached up and removed pins from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. The disguise was over. Tomorrow she would face whatever came as herself. Outside, wind picked up, carrying dust and livestock scent and distant rain. And in gathering darkness, battle lines were being drawn. Dawn came gray, and cold sun hidden behind clouds, promising rain that would likely never arrive. Olga woke to boots on stairs and voices arguing below. She had slept fitfully, fully dressed medical bag within reach. Nayati had spent the night in a chair by the door rifle, across knees, dozing in shifts with practiced vigilance. When her eyes opened, he was alert. "Boy's still breathing," he said quietly. "Checked an hour ago. Color's good." Olga rose, splashed water on her face. Her reflection was a stranger's hair-tangled eyes, shadowed body shape no longer hidden. She braided quickly, tucked it under her hat from habit, and picked up her bag. Pike was in the kitchen, drinking coffee bulk, filling a chair. The boy slept on a cot near the stove, breathing steady through the reed. A ranch hand stood guard rifle slung casually. Pike looked up as Olga entered. He made it through the night. He did. Olga set her bag on the table, began unpacking supplies. "I need to change dressing and check for infection. After that, he should be stable enough for me to leave." "About that." Pike set his cup down deliberately. "I've decided to offer a contract. $50 monthly room and board if you want exclusive medical services for my operation. You sign, Halder doesn't hear about forged papers or unlicensed practice." Olga kept hands busy arranging instruments. "And if I decline?" "Then Halder hears everything. You're on the next stage out of territory." Pike's voice was pleasant, almost conversational, which made the threat infinitely chilling. "If you're lucky, your choice." She met his gaze, reading calculation there. Pike saw people as tools or obstacles. Refusing outright would be foolish, but accepting would trap her. She needed time, leverage, something to shift balance. "I'll need to see the contract in writing," she said. "And I'll want to consult someone before signing." Pike's smile was thin. "No lawyers in Cinder Bluff. But I'll have something drawn up by week's end. You can decide then." It was a delay, nothing more, but Olga took it. She nodded and turned to the boy. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, applied fresh bandages, checked reed placement. The tissue was pink, but not inflamed. No red streaks, no infection. The boy stirred, but didn't wake, which was good. Sleep healed. When she finished, Pike had a man drive them back to town in a wagon. The ride was silent, and the hand's presence a reminder they were watched, measured, controlled. They were dropped at Cinder Bluff's edge near the freight yard. Olga climbed down bag heavy and watched the wagon rattle away. "He'll push till he gets what he wants," Nayati said quietly. "I know." Olga turned to face him. "But I won't work for him. Not like that. Not as property. Then you'll need allies. And evidence." She nodded slowly. "If Pike's doing something illegal, something even Halder can't ignore that might give me leverage." Nayati considered. "There's been trouble on the North Prairie. Wells poisoned, fences cut. Homesteaders blame Pike's men, but no one's caught them. Poisoned wells." Olga's mind shifted to diagnostics. "What kind of poison?" "Don't know for certain. But 2 railroad workers got sick last week from drinking water near Kettle Creek. Fever, vomiting, convulsions. They recovered, but it was close." Olga felt pieces clicking into place. If I could test the water, identify the poison that would be evidence. Proof of deliberate sabotage. Dangerous evidence. Nayati's expression was grave. Pike's men patrol that area. If they catch you, then you'll be there to make sure they don't. The words came before she could consider them, but she didn't take them back. She saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something like respect. "Tonight," he said after a moment. "After sundown. Bring what you need for testing." They parted Olga to her clinic, Nayati to his camp by the creek. She spent the afternoon preparing gathering glass vials, litmus paper, a small spirit lamp. She also packed bandages and suture thread, because experience taught that plans often failed in exactly the ways you didn't anticipate. As sun dipped below bluffs, painting sky in blood and copper, she changed into sturdy clothes and laced boots tight. May appeared at the clinic door just as Olga finished. The schoolteacher took in vials and spirit lamp at the determined set of Olga's jaw and sighed. "You're going after Pike. After evidence." Olga secured vials in a padded pouch. "If I can prove his men are poisoning wells, that's territorial offense. Even Halder can't ignore that. And if you can't prove it, if they catch you, then I'm no worse off." Olga met May's eyes. "I won't be owned, May. Not by Pike, not by anyone." May nodded slowly, resigned, but admiring. "You're as stubborn as Burnham. All right, but take this." She produced a small derringer from her apron, two-shot pistol with pearl handle. "My husband's. I never learned to shoot properly, but maybe you'll have better luck." Olga took the pistol, feeling its weight. She had never fired a gun, but the solid reality was reassuring. She tucked it in her coat pocket and thanked May. Nayati was waiting at the creek when twilight thickened to darkness. He had a mule saddled and loaded with canvas tarp and rope. He handed Olga a canteen and jerky, which she ate quickly, not having realized her hunger. "We'll head north along the dry wash," he said, voice low. "Stay below the ridge line so we don't show against sky. The wells are about 2 hours' ride." They moved through darkness with silence that spoke of long practice, at least on Nayati's part. He led reading ground, even in starlight, guiding the mule around loose rock and prickly pear. Olga followed one hand on the vial pouch to prevent clinking. The desert at night was different, full of sounds she couldn't identify, and shadows that moved strangely. Coyotes yipped in distance. Once an owl passed overhead close enough, she heard wing whisper. They reached the first well just after midnight. Hand dug perhaps 12 feet deep, ringed with stones and fitted with wooden bucket. Nayati checked the area with swift efficiency, eyes and ears alert, then nodded. Olga knelt by the well and lowered a vial on string, filling it with water below the surface. Even in darkness, she could see faint greenish tint. She corked it, held it to starlight, confirming suspicion. "Copper salts," she murmured. "Copper sulfate, most likely. Used for treating algae in stock tanks, but in these concentrations toxic to humans. Causes vomiting, convulsions, organ damage." "Can you prove someone put it there deliberately?" "Not from water alone. But if I can find the source container bag, anything with residue that would be conclusive." They moved to the second well, 1/4 mile east. Olga collected another sample, this one more discolored. As she sealed the vial, Nayati went still in that particular way, meaning danger. "Riders," he said softly. 2, maybe 3, from the west. Olga's heart kicked. She capped the vial, shoved it in her pouch, then crouched low beside the stone ring. Nayati moved the mule into shadow, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. He drew his rifle. Hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed. Voices carried on still air. Thought I saw something out here. Probably coyotes, or that damn engine. The riders drew closer. Olga pressed flat against stones, hand finding the derringer. Metal was cold, slightly oily. Her finger found the trigger guard. Nayati was invisible among shadows, but she knew he was there, watching, calculating. The riders came into view, silhouettes against stars. 2 men on horseback, one carrying a rifle, the other swinging a lantern in slow arcs. They reined up near the well, close enough Olga could hear saddle creak and tack jingle. "Check it," the one with lantern said. The other dismounted, boots crunching gravel. He walked to the well, footsteps loud. Olga held her breath, pressed so flat, she felt individual stone edges digging into ribs. The man was less than 6 feet away. If he looked left, he would see her. A rattlesnake buzzed suddenly, loud, aggressive. The man jumped back, cursing fluently. The snake slithered into rock scales, rasping stone. The man's horse shied violently, nearly unseating him as he tried to remount. "To hell with this," he muttered. "Ain't getting paid enough for rattlers at midnight." They turned horses and rode back, lantern light bobbing and fading. Olga sagged against the well, pulse thundering. Nayati emerged from shadows, rifle still in hand. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close." He scanned the horizon, expression grim. "We should head back." But Olga shook her head. "Not yet. If they're patrolling specifically here, there must be something nearby they're protecting. Maybe the poison source." Nayati hesitated, weighing risk against gain. Then nodded. 5 minutes. Then we leave, whether we find anything or not." They searched quickly, working outward in widening circles. Olga found it almost by accident, her boot catching on something half buried. She dropped to her knees, brushed away dirt, revealing a wooden crate. Stenciled letters, copper sulfate. Livestock use, handle with care. The crate was empty, but green residue crusted the inside. "This is it," she said, voice tight with excitement and vindication. "This is proof." Nayati dragged the crate free and lashed it to the mule. They were turning to leave when a gunshot split the night, shockingly loud. The bullet kicked sand 2 feet from Olga's boot. She spun, saw rifle muzzle flash on the ridge. "Run," Nayati said, voice absolutely calm. They ran. 2 more shots, cracked bullets whining close enough to feel air displacement. Nayati returned fire, not aiming, just buying seconds. They reached the dry wash and plunged in, the mule scrambling on loose stone. The wash twisted, offering cover, but limiting visibility. Olga's lungs burned, ribs aching where linen chest binder pressed despite being looser. She clawed at laces, gasping. Nayati caught her arm. "Stop. Hold still." He pulled her into shadow of an overhang, one hand on her shoulder. His other hand drew his knife. With swift, precise movements, he cut through corset laces, just as he had in the desert. Air flooded her lungs in desperate rush. She bent double, coughing, then straightened. "Thank you." "Can you ride?" She nodded. He boosted her onto the mule, then swung up behind arms, coming around to grip reins. The mule lunged forward, finding footing in darkness with sure instinct. They rode hard, pursuit fading as they put distance between themselves and Pike's men. By the time they reached the creek at Cinder Bluff's edge, eastern sky was beginning to pale. They dismounted in silence, both breathing hard. Olga's hands shook, adrenaline draining, leaving exhaustion. Nayati untied the crate and handed it to her, green residue clearly visible even in pre-dawn dimness. "Evidence," he said. She took it, feeling weight both literal and metaphorical. "Now we just have to make sure it reaches someone who'll act before Pike kills us." Nayati's expression was unreadable in growing light. "He'll try. We'll have to be smarter." Olga looked at him at calm determination in his eyes, and felt connection solidify into something deeper than gratitude or alliance. They had gone into desert as two people helping each other survive. They had come back as partners. The word felt inadequate, but it was all she had. "We'll be careful," she said. Nayati nodded. Then, with hesitation she hadn't seen before, he reached out and brushed a hair strand from her face. His touch was light, careful, and it sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with exertion. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be harder." She wanted to say more, to name the thing unfurling in her chest, but exhaustion stole her words. She nodded, shouldered the crate, and headed toward her clinic. Nayati watched until she was safely inside, then turned and led the mule toward his camp. The sun rose behind them, painting bluffs in gold and crimson, and the dangerous game entered its next phase. The crate sat on Olga's clinic table like an indictment, green-stained interior damning evidence of deliberate poisoning. She had spent the morning testing residue using litmus paper and careful heat application, confirming copper sulfate in concentrations far beyond accidental contamination. This was sabotage, pure and calculated. The question was how to use this evidence without getting killed. May had an idea. She arrived at midday with bread and information. "Elias," she said without preamble. "He's got connections. Used to serve with a federal marshal during the war. Might be able to send a telegram, get someone out here who isn't in Pike's pocket." It was a slim thread, but better than nothing. That afternoon, Olga and May carried the crate to Elias's forge, where furnace heat made air shimmer. Elias was working iron when they entered, hammer ringing against anvil in steady rhythm. He looked up, taking in their grim expressions, and the crate May set on his workbench. "Trouble." His voice was a low rumble. "Evidence." Olga showed him the residue, explained poisoned wells and sick railroad workers. "We need to get word to territorial authorities. May said you might know someone." Elias wiped his hands on a rag-scarred face, thoughtful. "I know a man. Federal marshal named Cobb. Served with him at Vicksburg. Honest man, which is rare. Problem is getting a telegram to him without Halder knowing." "Why would Halder know?" Olga asked. "Because Halder's brother-in-law runs the telegraph office. Everything that goes over wire Halder sees first. He'll know we're bringing in outside law before the message even leaves town. Then we send it from Red Rock," May said practically. "That's 6 hours each way," Elias pointed out. "And Pike's men watch the roads. They see one of us heading out with purpose, they'll follow." Nayati spoke from the doorway, his appearance so silent, all three startled. "I can get a message through. I know back trails. Pike's men don't." Olga felt relief and fear in equal measure. "It's dangerous. If they catch you, everything is dangerous right now." His gaze was steady. "Write your message. I'll have it on wire by tomorrow night." They composed the telegram together, keeping it brief. "Wells poisoned. Copper sulfate stop. 2, 6 stop evidence secured. Stop request investigation. Cinder Bluff stop." They signed with May's name. Nayati folded the paper, tucked it inside his shirt, then left without ceremony. But before he departed for Red Rock, Nayati pulled Elias aside. Olga saw them speaking in low tones near the forge, saw Elias nod slowly, his expression turning thoughtful. When Nayati left, the blacksmith returned to his anvil, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, working through some private calculation. The waiting was agony. Olga tried to work seeing patients who still came after dark. She treated an infected finger, dosed a feverish child, helped a worried pregnant woman. May stayed some nights, the two women keeping company over weak coffee and comfortable silence. On the third day, trouble arrived with boots and shouting and a sharp gunshot that echoed off false-fronted buildings. Olga was cleaning instruments when she heard commotion. She grabbed her bag and ran into the street. A crowd had gathered near the North End lanterns, casting wild shadows. She pushed through and found a young homesteader on the ground, blood soaking his shirt. Perhaps 20, barely old enough for a proper beard, and unconscious. "What happened?" Olga demanded, dropping beside him. "Pike's men," someone said, voice tight with anger. "Jumped him on the road. Beat him near to death, then one stuck a knife in him." The knife wound was just below ribs, angled upward. Blood pulsed with each heartbeat, dark, steady. Olga pressed a folded cloth against it, applying firm pressure. "Get him inside. Someone bring boiled water and clean linen, now." They carried him to her clinic, 4 men struggling with dead weight. Olga worked by lamplight hands, steady despite fear coiling in her gut. The knife had missed the liver by perhaps an inch, but had nicked the diaphragm. She had to open the wound wider, assess damage repair, what she could reach. 90 minutes of careful work stitching torn muscle with boiled carbolic solution thread. When she finally tied off the last suture and stepped back, her hands cramped and vision blurred with exhaustion. The homesteader's breathing was stronger color, better. He would survive if infection didn't set in. Olga washed her hands in rust-colored water, then turned to find Deputy Danton in her doorway. Luke Danton was lean and weathered, in his 30s, with eyes giving nothing away. Former ranch foreman before Halder deputized him. Everyone knew he kept a private ledger for Pike. "Sheriff wants to see you," Danton said. "I'm busy." "Wasn't a request." Voice flat, emotionless. "Come on." Olga glanced at May, who stood with arms crossed, expression fierce despite her small stature. "I'll watch him," May said quietly. "Go." Halder was waiting outside the saloon, flanked by 2 of Pike's men. The sheriff's florid face was slick with sweat despite cool evening air. "You've been busy," Halder said, tone deceptively mild. "Treating homesteaders poking around up north. Pike's getting tired of it." "Pike doesn't own this town," Olga said. "Near enough." Halder stepped closer, sour whiskey smell on his breath. "You're going to close that clinic. Stop treating people without proper license. And forget about those wells and that crate. Understand? Or what? Or I arrest you for practicing medicine under false pretenses. You spend the next few years in territorial prison." Halder's smile was unpleasant. "If you make it that far. Accidents happen to prisoners." Olga felt watching eyes townsfolk in doorways and windows. This was theater. Halder forcing her to choose between submission and destruction, doing it publicly so there would be no doubt about power. Before she could respond, a voice cut through tension. "You've got no jurisdiction over federal crimes, Halder." Elias stepped from shadows, a rolled paper in his scarred hand. Behind him stood perhaps a dozen men, homesteaders, townspeople, freight drivers, all armed with rifles or shotguns, expressions grim. "This is federal matter now." Elias continued unrolling the paper. "Telegram came through an hour ago. Marshal Cobb sending an investigator. Should be here in 3 days. He'll want to see evidence about poisoned wells. He'll also want to know who's been threatening the witness." Halder's face went from florid to mottled purple. "You're bluffing. Read it yourself." Elias tossed the paper at Halder's feet. "Or take it up with the marshal." The sheriff bent, snatched up the telegram hands, shaking slightly. He scanned it, and Olga watched calculation play across his face. Pike's men shifted uneasily. Danton's fingers brushed his revolver butt. 3 days, Elias said, voice carrying absolute conviction. "Then this gets sorted proper. In the meantime, Doc keeps working and nobody lays a hand on her." Clear. Halder crumpled the telegram and dropped it in dust. "This isn't over." No, Elias agreed. It's not. The sheriff and his men withdrew, melting into darkness. The crowd lingered, a silent show of support, and then dispersed. Olga let out a held breath. Elias lowered his rifle, looking at her with something like approval. That bought us time, he said. But not much. 3 days before the marshal's man arrives. Pike and Halder will use every hour to cover tracks or make us disappear. Where's Nayati? Olga asked, suddenly afraid for him. Still on the trail, far as I know. Probably best he stays clear till the investigator gets here. But what Elias didn't say, what he kept to himself, was the conversation he'd had with Nayati before the warrior left for Red Rock. Nayati had mentioned hearing rumors in saloons, whispers about a ledger Halder kept. Not the accounts the town saw, but a private record of bribes and deals. Elias, who had lived in Cinder Bluff longer than most and knew its secrets, had nodded slowly. He knew about that ledger, knew where Halder likely kept it, in the sheriff's office, hidden in a false bottom drawer. He had been waiting for the right moment, the right leverage to make use of that knowledge. And now, with federal law coming and tensions reaching breaking point, that moment was approaching. Olga nodded, but unease gnawed at her. 3 days felt like eternity when every hour carried possibility of violence. That night, she lay awake listening to the wounded homesteaders' breathing and distant coyote howls. She thought about Nayati riding through dangerous country with her message. She thought about Pike and Halder, about power they wielded and lengths they would go to protect it. And she thought about her choice to stand and fight, even though it might cost everything. Sometime before dawn, she finally slept, and in dreams, she felt a steady hand on her shoulder and heard a voice saying, "Breathe, doctor." Nayati returned on the evening of the second day, riding into town at twilight on an exhausted horse. Dust coated him from hat to boots, and he moved with careful stiffness of someone who had been in the saddle too long. Olga met him at the creek, unable to keep relief from flooding her face. "You're all right?" she said, hearing how inadequate the words were. "Mostly." He dismounted with visible effort, favoring his left side. "Got the telegram sent. Had to circle wide around Pike's patrols. They've got men watching all main approaches." "Were you followed?" "Not anymore." His tone suggested a story he wasn't ready to share. "But there's something you need to know." They walked to Elias's forge, where May and the blacksmith were waiting. Nayati refused a chair, standing with arms crossed, expression grave. "While I was in Red Rock, I heard talk," he said without preamble. "About a wanted notice. Railroad detectives been looking for someone to blame for freight wagon fire last year. 2 men died. He's offering bounty, and someone gave him my name." Olga felt cold dread settle like a stone. "Why would anyone blame you?" "Because I was there. I was guiding that freight run when raiders came out of the hills, started shooting set fire to wagons. I got drivers out, but 2 outriders died protecting cargo." He paused, jaw tightening. "Someone told the detective I was working with raiders, that I set them up. It's a lie, but he doesn't care about truth. He wants someone to hang, and I'm convenient." "Pike," Elias said flatly. "Has to be. He profits from keeping territory unstable. Probably paid good money to put your name forward." Nayati nodded. "The detective telegraphed Halder. There's $500 reward for bringing me in." May made a small distressed sound. "Halder will try to arrest you." "Or worse," Nayati agreed quietly. "He'll use it as excuse to get rid of me and anyone helping me." Olga's mind raced through possibilities, searching for leverage or strategy. The marshal's investigator was supposed to arrive tomorrow, but if Halder moved against Nayati tonight, by morning, everything could be over. "We hide you," she said decisively. Until the investigator arrives. Once he's here, once we present evidence about poisoned wells, and Pike's sabotage, truth will come out. Where? May asked practically. Halder knows every building in town. The schoolhouse, Olga said, the idea forming as she spoke. There's a cellar under the floor, isn't there, behind the coal bin? May nodded slowly. It's small, barely big enough for one person. We use it for storing slates and old textbooks. But yes, it could work. Nayati shook his head. If they find me there, they'll arrest you too. All of you. Then we make sure they don't find you. Olga's voice was steady, though fear trembled beneath. We've come this far. We're not giving up. Elias grunted agreement. I'll keep watch from here. Anyone comes sniffing around the schoolhouse, I'll raise alarm loud enough to wake the dead. But Elias had another plan forming in his mind. While they hid Nayati, while they waited for the marshal's investigator, he would make his move. Tonight, when Halder was distracted, Elias would break into the sheriff's office. He would find that ledger the real one, not whatever forgery Pike and Halder might be preparing. And when the moment came, when they needed it most, he would have the evidence to expose everything. They moved quickly, smuggling Nayati into the schoolhouse after full dark. The cellar was accessed through a hatch in the floor, hidden beneath the coal bin May used for the stove. The space below was cramped and airless, smelling of dust and old paper. Barely large enough to lie down, perhaps 2 feet of clearance when sitting. May brought blankets and a canteen. Olga left a small medical kit. Nayati settled in without complaint, though she could see strain in his eyes, not fear, but the wearing tension of being trapped. One day, she told him, crouching at the hatch edge. Just hold on for one more day. He caught her hand before she could pull away. Olga. She looked back, surprised by use of her given name. In dim candlelight, his face was all angles and shadows. Thank you, he said quietly, for standing with me. She squeezed his hand, feeling warmth and strength, the calluses that spoke of hard work and survival. We stand together now. That's what this means. She climbed out, May pulled the hatch closed, and together they dragged the coal bin back into position. The schoolteacher dusted off her hands and met Olga's eyes in near darkness. You care about him, May said. Not a question. Olga didn't deny it. He's saved my life more than once. Stood between me and harm without being asked. It's more than that. May's smile was sad and knowing. I can see it in how you look at him, how he looks at you. Just be careful. The world's not kind to people like us. People who choose their own path. Olga didn't ask what May meant by people like us. But she thought she understood. 2 women who had lost conventional life's protections, one through widowhood, one through the choice to practice medicine, finding solidarity in margins. The next morning dawned hot and still air heavy with promise of storm that might never come. Olga was grinding herbs when May burst through the door, face white as chalk. Halder's at the schoolhouse, May gasped. He's searching for Nayati. He's got Danton and 2 of Pike's men. Olga's heart plummeted. How did he know? I don't know, but he's tearing the place apart. They ran. By the time Olga reached the schoolhouse, a crowd had gathered, townsfolk, homesteaders, children who should have been at lessons. Halder stood in the doorway, holding something. As Olga pushed through the crowd, she saw what it was, a red leather ledger, the kind used for accounting. Well, Halder said loud enough for everyone to hear. Looks like we found more than we bargained for. Olga's blood turned to ice. A ledger. But which ledger? Where had Halder found it? May pushed forward, face-stricken. That's not what? Halder flipped it open, reading aloud. Payments to Dr. Josiah Burnham for laudanum supplied to Bennett Pike's operation. Dates going back 6 months. Signed slips with Burnham's signature. He looked up, gaze locking on Olga with triumph. Except Burnham's been dead over a month, which means someone's been forging his name. Someone who had access to his papers and medicine stores. The crowd murmured like wind through dry grass. Olga felt the trap closing. She had signed those slips herself using Burnham's name because the store wouldn't sell to her directly. But she had thought they were for legitimate medical use. If Pike had been using laudanum for something else, selling it, stockpiling it, and if Halder could prove she had enabled it. "You've been working with Pike all along," Halder said, voice dripping false regret. "Providing him with narcotics under a dead man's name. That's federal offense. And now you're harboring a wanted fugitive." "Where is he?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Olga said, forcing steadiness. "Don't lie to me." Halder stepped closer, ledger clutched like a weapon. "We found this hidden in the schoolhouse, along with a bedroll and supplies. Someone's been sleeping here. Someone you've been hiding. Tell me where he is, and maybe the judge goes easy." May stepped forward, small frame vibrating with fury. "That ledger isn't mine. Someone planted it. I'll swear that in front of any judge." "Sure they did." Halder's smile was ugly. "Danton, take the doctor into custody. Charge her with fraud, narcotic trafficking, and aiding a fugitive." Danton moved forward, drawing his revolver. Olga felt hands close around her arms, felt herself being pulled toward the street. She scanned the crowd desperately, looking for Elias, for allies, for any help. Her eyes locked with Nayate's. He was standing at the crowd's edge, half hidden behind a taller man's face, obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Their gazes met for just an instant, a heartbeat of connection across chaos. She saw the question in his eyes. Should I move? Should I reveal myself? She gave the slightest head shake. Not yet. Wait for the right moment. He nodded, barely perceptible, and faded back. Olga was dragged toward the jail, a small stone building with a single barred window and a door that clanged shut with finality. Danton shoved her into the cell, locked it, left without a word. She sank onto the narrow cot, trying to think through panic. The ledger was a forgery, had to be. Someone Pike, most likely with Halder's help, had planted it to frame her, destroy her credibility, eliminate her as threat. But proving it was a forgery would be nearly impossible. Outside she heard shouting, then breaking glass. She stood, pressed her face to barred window. The street was full of people now, more than she had ever seen gathered. Someone was throwing papers into the air sheets, fluttering down like snow. Olga squinted, trying to make out writing. It was ledger pages, torn out and scattered. And on those pages, visible even from her cell, were not just her forged slips, but entries detailing bribes paid to Halder for looking away shipments of stolen goods under false names, payments to Danton for information and protection, and most damning, a note about the freight wagon fire with Pike's name and payment clearly linked to riot instigation and native elimination. The real ledger, not the forgery Halder had shown, but the original Pike had been keeping to track his operations. Someone had found it and was making sure everyone in Cinder Bluff knew what it contained. Olga's heart soared. Then she heard the gunshot, and the world tilted sickeningly. The gunshot shattered fragile order. People scattered, some diving for cover, others running toward the sound. Smoke rose from near the schoolhouse, thick and black, speaking of deliberate fire. The jail door flew open. Elias stood there, sledgehammer in hands, May at his side. The blacksmith didn't waste time. He swung the hammer at the lock once, twice, and the mechanism shattered with a screech. The door swung open. "Come on," Elias said. Olga grabbed her coat and followed into the street. Chaos reigned. Ledger pages were everywhere, people snatching them up and reading aloud, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Halder was shouting orders no one heeded. Danton was trying to organize Pike's men, but they were outnumbered and confused. "Where's Nayati?" Olga asked. "Armory shack," May said, voice tight. Danton's men grabbed him during the confusion. They're planning to move him to Pike's ranch before the investigator arrives. Rage flooded through Olga, hot and clarifying. "We have to stop them." "Already on it." Elias gestured toward townspeople, moving with purpose toward the armory. "Folks have had enough." They ran. The armory shack was low and windowless, near the livery used for storing old rifles and ammunition. Danton and 3 Pike's men were outside trying to load Nayati, hands bound, face bruised and bloodied, onto a horse. Nayati wasn't making it easy, his body dead weight resistance, but he was outnumbered and injured. "Let him go," Olga shouted. Danton turned, hand dropping to revolver. "Stay back, Doc. This ain't your concern." "The hell it isn't." Elias raised his rifle, a dozen townspeople doing the same. "You're outnumbered. Let him go and we'll call it even." Danton's face twisted. He glanced at Pike's men, weighing options. Then, without warning, he fired. The shot went wild, meant to intimidate. Elias returned fire, and suddenly everyone was shooting. Olga dropped to the ground, hands over her head, as bullets whined overhead, splintering wood and ricocheting off stone. She crawled toward the armory, mind focused on one thing: Nayati. She reached the structure just as Pike's men retreated inside, dragging Nayati with them and barring the door. A moment later, smoke began seeping through wall cracks. They had set it on fire. "No," Olga breathed. She pounded on the door. "Let him out, he'll suffocate." No answer. Smoke thickened rapidly, black and oily. She heard coughing from inside, desperate, racking. Elias appeared beside her, blood staining his shoulder. "They shot you," she said. "I'll live." Elias grimaced. "But we need to get him out before the whole thing goes up." May arrived with a crowbar. She wedged it into the door frame and pulled with all her strength. Olga joined her, both straining. The door groaned, nails shrieking. Elias shouldered it once hard, and the door burst inward. Smoke poured out in a choking wave. Nayati stumbled into light hands, still bound, coughing violently. Olga caught him, guiding him away from the burning shack. She pulled her knife and sawed through ropes. His wrists were raw and bleeding. "You're hurt," she said. "So are you." Voice hoarse from smoke, but eyes clear. He looked past her, scanning chaos. "Where's Halder?" "Don't know." Olga turned to check Elias, who was leaning against the livery with May pressing cloth to his shoulder. Blood soaked through, but the blacksmith's color was still good. "We need to move. This isn't over." As if summoned, a massive dust storm rolled in from the east. Sky turned yellow, then bronze, then almost black. Wind hit like a physical blow, tearing at clothes and hair. Visibility dropped to nothing, the world reduced to swirling grit and wind roar. Olga's lungs seized. Dust was everywhere, coating her throat, choking her. She felt her corset shift, remaining stays, digging into ribs, restricting what little air she could pull. Panic clawed at her. She was going to suffocate here in open air. Hands found her in darkness. Nayati's hands, she knew them by touch. He pulled her down into the lee of a building or rock. His knife came out, and she felt him cutting through corset laces with precision he had shown twice before. "Breathe, doctor," he said, voice close to her ear, steady despite the storm. Air rushed in. She coughed, choked, managed a full breath. Then another. Nayati kept one hand on her shoulder, anchoring her while the storm raged around them. She couldn't see him, could barely hear him, but she knew he was there. Solid. Reliable. Choosing to stay with her when running would have been safer. The storm lasted perhaps an hour, time meaningless in howling dark. When it finally began to subside, wind dropping from scream to moan, then they emerged coated in red dust like something risen from graves. Town was transformed, every surface buried buildings, half obscured by drifts. People emerged, slowly checking for injuries, calling names. Olga found May and helped drag Elias to shelter in the forge. The blacksmith's wound was still bleeding, bullet lodged near the collarbone. Olga cleaned her hands as best she could with forge trough water, then set to work. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "Everything hurts," Elias said, managing a faint grin. "Just get it done." She widened the wound with her scalpel, probed carefully with forceps, and found the bullet lodged against bone. 15 minutes of careful work to extract it without shattering the collarbone. When she finally dropped the flattened bullet into May's palm, both women were shaking with relief. Olga packed the wound, sutured it closed, bound Elias's shoulder with strips from a relatively clean shirt May provided. "You'll live," Olga told him. "Figured I would." Elias looked at May, who was holding his uninjured hand, with white-knuckled intensity. "I'm too stubborn to die. Learned that from you." Olga cleaned her hands again and stood legs unsteady. Nayati was waiting by the door, silhouetted against slowly clearing air. She crossed to him, suddenly aware how close to losing him she had come. "You came for me," he said quietly. "Of course I did." The words came fierce, almost angry. "Did you think I would leave you to burn? I thought you would be smart, stay safe." "Smart would have been running the first time I saw Pike's men. I'm past smart." She reached up, touched his face, fingers gentle on bruises. "We're in this together. That's what it means." He caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. In dust-filtered light, his eyes were dark and bottomless. "Together," he repeated, testing the word's weight. Shouts from outside interrupted them. Olga turned to see Halder and 2 remaining Pike's men attempting to flee on horseback, heading north toward Pike's ranch. Townspeople were moving to cut them off, but they were on foot and riders had a head start. "We can't let them warn Pike," Elias said from his makeshift bed. "If Pike runs, all this evidence means nothing." Nayati was already moving. He caught 2 horses from the livery animals, too spooked by storm to have run far, and brought them to the forge. He handed reins to Olga. "Can you ride?" "I'll manage." They mounted and kicked horses into motion, chasing Halder's retreating figures through settling dust. Prairie opened before them, red and raw and endless. Olga clung to the saddle, her body remembering childhood lessons in Russia when her father had taught her to ride. Nayati rode beside her, matching her pace, attention split between trail ahead and her safety. They caught up at a narrow canyon where trail funneled between high rock walls. Halder reined up hard when he saw them blocking the path. Behind them, more riders appeared, Elias somehow in saddle despite his injury. May on a mule, and a dozen townspeople armed with whatever they could carry. "It's over, Halder," Nayati said. "The hell it is." Halder drew his revolver. 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. Halder fired shot going wide. Elias threw something, a horseshoe that struck Halder's gun arm with bone-breaking force. And Nayati moved his horse between Olga and the sheriff, shielding her with his body. The sheriff's gun dropped into dust. Pike's men raised hands in surrender loyalty, only going so far. Nayati dismounted, walked to Halder, and with efficient economy pulled the man from his horse and bound his hands with rope. Federal Marshal's investigator arrives in town today. Nayati said, voice perfectly calm. You can explain everything to him. Halder spat blood into dust. Pike will have both your heads. Pike's already in custody, May said, riding up on her mule. She held a paper, another telegram. Marshal's deputies picked him up this morning trying to cross state line. He'll hang for murder, sabotage, and about a dozen other charges. It's over, Halder. You lost. The sheriff's face went from red to gray. He sagged in Nayati's grip, all fight draining. They hauled him and his men back to town, a slow procession through devastated landscape. By the time they arrived, the federal marshal's investigator was waiting, a lean man, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. His name was Garrett, and he set about documenting everything with methodical efficiency. The next days passed in a blur of statements and evidence examination. Garrett interviewed dozens of witnesses, compiled ledger pages, inspected the crate with its damning copper sulfate residue, sent daily telegrams. Halder and Danton were held in the jail they had used to imprison others. Pike was brought back under guard arrogance, finally stripped away. Through it all, Olga worked treating injuries from fire and gunfight, checking Elias's healing shoulder, removing the reed tube from Pike's son's throat, now that the windpipe had healed sufficiently. The boy would live with a scar, but he would live. Garrett came to her clinic one evening, manner respectful but direct. I'll need your testimony about poisoned wells and about your credentials. I was trained by my father, a military surgeon in the Russian army. I apprenticed under Dr. Burnham. My papers are in his name because territorial law forbids women from holding medical licenses. Olga met his eyes steadily. But the work I do is real. The people I've saved can attest. Garrett nodded slowly. I'll include that in my report. The territorial governor will decide what to do about your situation. But for what it's worth, Doctor, you've got more people vouching for you than I've ever seen. That counts. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. 2 weeks after the arrests, final information came to light. Garrett brought it personally, expression grim. We found Pike's full records, he said without preamble, including payment logs for the freight wagon raid last year. Pike hired the raiders, paid them to burn wagons and make it look like Lakota retaliation. Goal was to start conflict that would drive the Lakota off remaining land so he could claim water rights. Olga felt sick. He framed Nayati. He tried. The railroad detective was either incompetent or bribed, probably both. The bounty's been retracted, and I've sent letters to tribal councils explaining what happened. Nayati's name is clear. Relief washed through her so powerfully, it left her dizzy. Thank you. Thank him, Garrett said. He's the one who rode through hostile country to get that telegram sent. Without that, Pike and Halder would still be running this town. When Garrett left, Olga sat alone and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to cry. Not from fear or pain, but from overwhelming release of tension held too long. 3 months passed. The territorial governor reviewed Garrett's report and testimonies from Cinder Bluff residents. A letter arrived in early December, delivered by new Sheriff Grady, a quiet man with no ties to Pike, who treated everyone with measured respect. The letter granted Olga a provisional license to practice medicine contingent on passing a formal examination by a board of physicians in the territorial capital. The examination was scheduled for late February, giving her 3 months to prepare. May organized a small celebration in the schoolhouse, nothing elaborate but genuine. Townspeople brought food. Elias presented Olga with a new medical bag he had commissioned, leather-stitched and sturdy with her initials embossed, Dr. Olga Petrovich, in clear, proud letters. You earned it, Elias said simply. Ruthie, the girl whose leg Olga had saved, gave her a bundle of letters from patients' testimonies and thanks. "For your examination," Ruthie said shyly, "in case they need proof." Olga clutched the letter's throat too tight for words. Nayati watched from the room's edge, expression unreadable, but presence steady. When the celebration ended and people dispersed, he waited until they were alone. "Will you go to the Capitol?" he asked. "I have to. The examination is required." "I'll go with you. Help you prepare." Olga looked at him, at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "What about your people?" Garrett said he sent letters explaining what Pike did. "Have you heard anything?" Nayati was quiet a long moment. "My uncle came last week. Brought a message from the winter count keeper. The banishment has been lifted. The woman whose children I protected sent a letter to the council. Told them what I did, how I refused to harm innocents. The council reconsidered." Joy and fear warred in Olga's chest. "That's wonderful. You can go home." "I can." He met her eyes. "But I've built a life here, made connections, and you're here." The words were simple, but they carried weight of everything unspoken. "I don't want to leave you. Not unless you want me to go." Olga's breath caught. They stood in the empty schoolhouse winter light, slanting through windows, and she realized this was the moment. The choice that would define everything after. "I want you to stay," she said. "Come with me to the Capitol. Help me pass this examination. After that, we'll decide together about everything." "Together," Nayati repeated. He stepped closer, close enough she could feel warmth radiating from him. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands. Palms rough, calloused warm. "I've been alone 3 years, learning to survive without a place, without people who knew me. And then I found you drowning on dry land, and everything changed." "You changed it," Olga said softly. "You taught me to breathe. You taught me there are things worth fighting for besides survival." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "Worth staying for." They stood like that, foreheads touching in a gesture more intimate than any kiss, and made their silent promises. No grand declarations, no dramatic vows. Just two people who had found each other in chaos and decided to hold on. The next 3 months were intense but productive. Olga studied every medical text she could acquire, reviewing anatomy and pharmacology and surgical techniques, until knowledge was woven into her bones. Nayati helped in unexpected ways, quizzing her on terminology, keeping her supplied with food and coffee when she forgot to eat, organizing notes when they became chaotic. May tutored her on political aspects of medicine, the kind of questions a territorial board might ask to test not just knowledge, but judgment. They left for the Capitol in late February, riding the stage with Olga's trunk of books and her new medical bag. The journey took 4 days, and they spent evenings in way stations reviewing case studies and discussing treatment protocols. Nayati's presence was a comfort Olga hadn't known she needed, grounding her when anxiety threatened. The examination was held in the Territorial Medical Hall, a stone building smelling of carbolic acid and old paper. Olga was one of only 3 women among 40 candidates, and scrutiny was immediate and intense. The examination lasted 2 days, written tests on anatomy and pathology, practical demonstrations on cadavers, oral examinations, where 4 physicians asked progressively difficult questions. On the second day, she performed a surgical procedure on a practice cadaver, removing a simulated appendix using techniques her father had taught, and antiseptic protocols from reading Lister's papers. Her hands were steady movements, precise. When she finished, one examiner, a gray-haired man with spectacles, nodded slowly. "Where did you learn that particular suturing technique?" he asked. "From my father, Dr. Dmitry Petrovich. He studied under Professor Nikolai Pirogov in St. Petersburg. Pirogov. The examiner's expression shifted to something approaching respect. I met him once at a surgical conference in Berlin. Brilliant man. If you learned from someone he trained, that explains a great deal. Results were posted 3 days later. Olga's name appeared on the list of those who had passed with notation license, granted with commendation. She stood staring at the paper, unable to quite believe it was real. Nayati was waiting outside. When she emerged with certificate clutched in her hands, he lifted her clear off the ground and spun her in a circle, both laughing. That night, they celebrated quietly in their small boarding house, toasting with weak tea. "You did it," Nayati said. "We did it," Olga corrected. "I wouldn't have made it without you." He set down his cup, reached across the table to take her hand. "What happens now?" "Now we go home." She said it without thinking, but as soon as the words were out, she realized she meant them. Cinder Bluff had become home. "I'll open my clinic officially, hang my name on the shingle, treat whoever needs treating. And I'll help." Nayati's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I can travel between town and my people, serve as a bridge. There's healing needed on both sides." "Together," Olga said. "Together." They returned to Cinder Bluff in early April, when desert was briefly green with spring rain. The town had changed. New families had settled, drawn by reports the area was becoming safer. The schoolhouse had been expanded, May teaching a second room full of students. Elias's forge thrived. His shoulder healed well enough for full days. Olga's clinic opened with a proper shingle DR. Olga Petrovich, licensed physician. Her certificate hung on the wall where everyone could see. Patients came steadily, homesteaders and townspeople, ranch hands and freighters. She treated them all with equal care, charging what they could afford and nothing when they couldn't. Nayati divided time between Cinder Bluff and Lakota camps to the north. He served as interpreter when territorial government sent representatives, helped negotiate disputes over water and grazing rights, slowly rebuilt connections his banishment had severed. His uncle visited once, bringing a winter robe, decorated with honor marks, symbols, acknowledging what Nayati had done, the choices he had made, the bridges he was building. 6 months after their return, a final surprise arrived. Marshal Garrett came through on his way to investigate a claim dispute. He stopped at Olga's clinic, carrying a folder. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it over. "We finished going through Pike's records. Found documentation of the wagon raid he orchestrated. Full confession from one of the raiders he hired, including Pike's instructions to make it look like Lakota aggression." Olga read through papers, anger rekindling as she absorbed the calculated cruelty. He tried to start a war. He did, and nearly succeeded. Garrett's expression was grim. But he failed. Pike was hanged last month for murder and sabotage. Halder got 20 years in territorial prison. Danton got 15 and agreed to testify against several other land grabbers using similar tactics. It was justice, not perfect, but real and meaningful. Garrett stayed for dinner, sharing a simple meal at May's insistence. He told them about the changing political landscape, the new territorial governor's commitment to enforcing law, fairly the slow, hard work of building society where justice meant something. After he left, Olga and Nayati walked to the creek as twilight settled. They sat on the bank where they had sat months before, shoulders touching, watching water run clear and steady. "Do you ever regret it?" Olga asked. "Choosing to stay here instead of returning fully to your people?" Nayati considered with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I regret the years I lost with them, but I don't regret the choice to stay. I found something here I didn't know I needed. Purpose. Connection. He looked at her dark eyes, reflecting last light. You. Olga felt warmth spread through her chest, the kind that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with being truly seen. I found the same. All my life, I fought to be allowed to practice medicine, to use my training and help people. I thought that was enough. But then I met you and I realized there was something more. Something I hadn't known I was missing. What was that? Partnership. Someone who sees me fully and chooses to stand beside me anyway. She turned to face him, taking his hand in both of hers. Someone who taught me that breathing, really breathing, being fully alive, isn't something you do alone. Nayati brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with tenderness that made her throat tighten. I love you, he said. Simple, direct, true in the way the best things were. I love you too, Olga replied. They kissed then finally under vast desert sky. It wasn't desperate or passionate, but steady and deep, a promise made flesh. When they pulled apart, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge one by one. The future wasn't certain, it never was. There would be challenges ahead, prejudices to overcome, hard choices to make. But they would face them together, these two people, who had found each other against all odds and learned to breathe as one. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, voices carrying across prairie. A night bird sang from cottonwoods. The creek murmured its endless song. And in gathering darkness, Olga Petrovich and Nayati sat together, building their life one choice, one breath, one moment at a time. The story of the Russian doctor and the Lakota warrior would be told in Cinderbluff for generations, the way they had stood against corruption, the way they had saved each other, the way they had chosen love and partnership in a world that tried to keep them apart. But in that moment, they were simply two people who had survived and learned to thrive, who had found in each other the courage to be fully themselves. And it was enough. It was everything.